So my talk is entitled Japan's invasion of Chosån Korea in 1592 to 1598 and its aftermath in East Asian history. And this particular war is known as the Imjin War or Imjin Waran, most commonly in Korea. This is about a story of Japan's invasion of Korea, more precisely the invasion of Chosån Korea by the Toyotomi Hideyoshi regime of Japan. As I said, it's called the Imjin War most commonly. It took place from the fourth month of 1592 and continued to the 11th month of 1598. So the war of Japan's invasion of Chosån Korea unfolded for about 6 years and 7 months. So how did it unfold? In 1592, Japan's military forces of more than 100,000 troops poured into Korea from the base of Nagoya, located in Kyushu of Japan, through Tsushima Island, and then intruded along these routes, as you see in the map. Not long after the invasion, Ming China, at the time, sent the troops to Korea in order to repel the Japanese invaders from the Korean Peninsula. It was a military help. As a result, Japan's invasion of Chosån Korea evolved into a major international conflict involving Korea, Japan, and China. So indeed, it proved to be a key watershed in premodern East Asian history in terms of regime change and the socio-economic development. What does China's involvement mean? In terms of international relations in pre-war times, China, Korea, and Japan in the region formed mutually respective bilateral relations and thereby maintained peace and border security. It means that three countries never met together nor formed what we might call an international system. But during the war, the three countries interacted each other in a trilateral manner for the first time in history, as you see in the diagram. After the war, however, the three countries returned back to respective bilateral relations, that is, Chosån Korea, Ming China relations, Korea-Japan relations, and Japan-China relations, not Korea-China-Japan relations. There were no such Korea-China-Japan relations, no trilateral relations. So what do I mean by that? If you say that in pre-modern times, there was a system of a Sino-centric or a China-centered world order, or a Sino-centric tributary system, that is wrong. There was no such a system applied to all countries in the region, although many scholars still habitually mention. In any case, this is what I would like to discuss today. Three key issues. The first, the progress of the war from 1592 to 1598. For this, we can ask, why did Japan's Hideyoshi regime invade Korea? How did Koreans fight back and shape the contours of the war? And how did Ming China's involvement in the war affected the progress of the war? The second, what impact did the war bring upon the three countries in terms of international relations? For this, I will focus on Chosån Korea's post-war international relations. Third, I will discuss what impact the war brought upon Chosŏn Korean society and economy. And as a conclusion, I will make some comments on the post-war longevity of the Joseon dynasty after the war. Now, first, I ask, what did Japan's Hideyoshi regime invade? Why did Japan's Hideyoshi regime invade Chosŏn Korea? First of all, Hideyoshi targeted Korea because he thought his military forces would easily subjugate Korea. If unwinnable, he would not have invaded, right? And so his invasion had to do with his perceptions, his knowledge and intelligence of Korea's military capability. And then you should ask, invasion for what? The answer is that Hideyoshi envisioned that such an easy military campaign would help him consolidate his power. So he did invade for gain, not for loss. The power was everything for him. However, a common narrative goes like this. Hideyoshi's goal was to conquer China, or in Japanese at the time, Kara-iri, Kara referring to tongue, but China, and iri is entering. So people say that Hideyoshi's goal was to conquer Ming China. Such a narrative has been dominant regarding the warfare that unfolded in Chosŏn Korea only for 7 years. In other words, it says that Hideyoshi invaded Chosŏn Korea in order to conquer China. Does it make sense? Is it true? It is not. It is a misleading myth. Simply, there is no evidence that supports such a narrative or such a myth. So what I have found through research is that number one, Hideyoshi's goal was to subjugate Chosŏn Korea for power consolidation. Number two, even so, his goal did not last long, but for a few months only in the first year of the war. And number three, more importantly, Hideyoshi struggled to salvage his doomed foreign military campaign for almost 6 years from the second year of the war, but he failed. More specifically about Hideyoshi's goal of invasion, this document says we use many different documents. On this date, that's the 13th day of the third month of 1592, Hideyoshi issued an order of attack on Joseon to his daimyo generals. The order was entitled on the number of troops set to cross the sea to Gorai, referring to Joseon. In this order, Hideyoshi made it clear what the goal his troops should achieve. It says the troops are charged to make Gorai, in this case referring to Joseon, more precisely the Joseon king, Seonjo, serve Hideyoshi or Japan. According to this order, on the 13th day of the fourth month, the first division of Japanese troops landed in Busan and attacked the Busanpo fortress. The Japanese troops followed suit. So with this, the war of Japan's invasion of Joseon started. The Japan's invasion of Chosŏn Korea progressed well, indeed too well. About 3 weeks later, the Japanese troops took the capital of Joseon, Hanseong, the current Seoul. Joseon's king, Seonjo, fled to the north for life. But soon after, Koreans began to fight back, and Ming China sent some 3,500 troops to Korea in the 7th month. They attacked the Konishi-Yukinaga troops in Pyongyang, but tasted a crushing defeat. They rushed back to China, never came out again. From the time on to the last month of 1592, no Chinese troops were in Korea. This is an important point. The Koreans kept fighting back. Only in the 11th month of the same year, Hideyoshi ordered the Japanese troops to stay away from Korean fighters. The Japanese troops turned defensive, and no Chinese troops yet in Korea. It means that the Koreans were able to frustrate the Japanese invaders by themselves. The Koreans were able to frustrate the Japanese troops, although not being able to drive them out. So out of frustration, Hideyoshi banned his troops from fighting against the Koreans. It means that Hideyoshi lost much of confidence in his war of invasion of Chosŏn by the 11th month of 1592, the first year of the war. Then Ming China sent a massive force of about 35,000 troops to Korea in the 12th month of 1592. In the first month of 1593, the Chinese troops attacked the Konishi troops in Pyongyang, current in North Korea. The Konishi troops routed south to the capital of Korea, where Japanese troops began to assemble for defense. Soon after, however, due to a shortage of food, military provisions, as well as Ming China's serious involvement, the Japanese decided to withdraw from Seoul. By the end of the 4th month of 1593, all Japanese troops withdrew to the Busan area. Hideyoshi then tried to find a way for ending the war from the 5th month of 1593. In Ming China, which lacked military capability for defeating the Japanese, also pursued a non-military settlement to the war. The conversation between Ming and Japan continued for more than 3 years. By the 9th month of 1596. In contrast, Chosån Korea opposed a non-military settlement to the war, even though it had no military ability to drive the Japanese troops out on its own. So in this situation, however, negotiations for a truce between Ming and Japan ended in failure only in the 9th month of 1596, as you see in these 3 phases of the war. So this war has 3 different phases: military confrontation and non-military effort to settle the war, and again, military confrontation. So in mid 1597, Japan relaunched a massive attack on Chosån. In this phase of 3 of the war, Hideyoshi's goal was to obtain a Korean prince as a hostage by force. In other words, through the pressure of destruction of human lives. For that, they pounded Jeolla province for massive destruction. They tried to pressure the Korean king to submit one of his sons as a hostage. Why did Hideyoshi try to obtain a Korean prince as a hostage? It was in order to trick a prince hostage as a symbol or evidence of his successful military campaign. So what we see is that in the beginning, he tried to subjugate Chosŏn Korea. It didn't go well. Later, he tried to obtain a Korean prince as a hostage in order to treat the hostage as the evidence of his success in the campaign. In this phase of 3 of the war, Ming China sent about 100,000 troops, whom it mobilized throughout the country, from Guangdong, from Guangxi, from Sichuan, everywhere, and mobilized them and sent them to Korea. It was a massive commitment to the war. However, without achieving anything, Hideyoshi died in the 8th month of 1598. After his death, the Japanese troops eventually all retreated back to their country. So as a result, the War of Japan's invasion of Chosŏn Korea was over, but in the 11th month of the same year. So this is a brief sketch of the progress of the war. Now, about the impact of the war. Japan failed to achieve anything, and as a result, the Hideyoshi regime collapsed in 1600. So this was the rule of the game. If you lose in the war, you should go. No other way. On the other hand, Ming China's military and financial strength sapped tremendously due to its massive commitment to the foreign war. Ming China collapsed in 1644. In contrast, the Joseon dynasty not only survived war, but also further lasted for more than 3 centuries to 1910. But do not make a mistake here. The Joseon dynasty's longevity was good for the ruling Yangban class of less than 10% of the entire population, but not necessarily good for the vast majority of the ruled class, who had to continue to suffer for centuries. So regarding Chosŏn Korea, you may want to ask, how could Korea survive the war and lasted for so long thereafter? A simple answer to this question is that Chosŏn Korea was able to keep its borders safe, both in the north and in the south. It was clear that Chosŏn Korea had no military capability to drive the Japanese invaders out. Joseon's low level of military strength was built into its governing system. And then how was it able to keep its borders safe? That was thanks to diplomacy, not military strength. For Chosŏn Korea, diplomacy was a lifeline of border security, at least from the 16th century. What I'm saying here is that the Joseon dynasty survived Japan's invasion and lasted for long thereafter, thanks all to its diplomacy, more than anything else. The issue of border security has to do with peace in the region or peaceful international relations. And here I'd like to contextualize the issue of post-war regional peace, which was associated with each country's border security issues. So no doubt, Japan's invasion of Joseon reminded that border security or foreign relations held the key to the survival and longevity of a dynasty or a regime. It was nothing new in premodern East Asian history. But the fact that the invaders regime collapsed so quickly while the invaded dynasty had a near-death experience, the Indian War must have dealt an alarming lesson to the ways in which Joseon, Japan, and Ming in the region tried to reconfigure post-war border security. All felt that international conflict, whether caused by invading a neighboring country or by being invaded by a neighboring country, was harmful to border security, regime's longevity, and regional peace. So, out of necessity, which each country felt strongly, peaceful relations were set to prevail in the region. So what happened in the post-war era is that the Joseon, Japan, and Ming each sought a most cost-effective way of border security for dynastic or regime's survival, stability, or power consolidation and longevity. The key point is to seek a cost-effective way of border security. The second, the respective interests of Joseon, Japan, and Ming were settled through three separate and mutually independent sets of bilateral relations. So Joseon-Japan relations, Joseon-Ming relations, Ming-Japan relations, all separate, not overlapping. The three respective sets of bilateral relations were combined to produce a geopolitical environment of peace in the region. This was a geopolitical environment that cannot be explained with such simple and one country-centered notions as hegemony, hierarchy, tributary relations, or sinocentric order. Now focusing on Chosån Korea, let me discuss the key features of Joseon-Ming bilateral relations. So while endeavoring to safeguard its southern border against Japan, Joseon worked to protect its northern border at two fronts, as you see in the map. One was against Ming China, with which Joseon shared a border along the southern part of the Amnok or Yalu River. And the other was against the Jochins, who were later called Manchus, who shared the border along both the northern part of the Amnok River and Tuman River. So Joseon's goal was to decouple its people from both the Chinese and Jochins, and thereby to demarcate itself from both Ming and the Jochins. This was the way of safeguarding its northern border, disconnecting itself from both Ming China and the Jochins. Now, first, how to demarcate itself from Ming China, which was a far bigger country. That was by minimizing contact with China. How to minimize contact with China? For that, Joseon banned any private contact, any private commercial transactions, and made the border, which separated the two countries, function as a line of no private trespassing. The only legal contact to be allowed was the channel of diplomacy, which refers to the exchange of envoys, officials traveling back and forth. So regarding Ming China, Joseon took a strategy of envoy or diplomacy. Regarding the Jochins, Joseon took a loose rein policy. It's called a loose rein policy, in which it offered them economic incentives for prevention of plundering. The Churchins sought economic benefits with the threat of border crossing plundering, and they did often. In response, Chosŏn offered material goods on the condition of their good behavior. So it was called loose rein policy, a conciliatory approach. If you like, you can say that, Chosŏn bribed them not to plunder the border area. There's some more words about the Chosŏn-Ming relations in conducting the envoy or diplomacy, which placed Ming above Chosŏn in status. The Ming court tried to wield some influence, particularly through the tool of investiture. Investiture refers to the Chinese emperor's sanction of Chosŏn kingship. However, Chosŏn's kingship was none of Ming's business from the beginning of the Chosŏn dynasty to the end. Despite the rhetoric of imperial investiture, the Chosŏn continued to guard its domestic autonomy, and Ming respected it. But likewise, Ming China inherited the rhetoric of imperial investiture in exchange for non-interference to Chosŏn's domestic governance. Now, about the Chosŏn-Japan relations, Chosŏn had two counterparts in the south as well. One is Japan's central government, which was the Tokugawa Bakufu in Edo, the current Tokyo, and the other was Tsushima Island, as you see in the map, which was located not far from Busan. Tsushima belonged to Japan, but it also maintained some independence in interacting with Chosŏn. In particular, Tsushima was dependent on trade with Chosŭn for survival. It means that Chosŭn had two foreign entities in the south, as it had two in the north. Soon after the war, Tsushima began to demand restoration of trade with a veiled threat of reinvasion for Chosŭn, which had repeatedly experienced Tsushima's double play. Tsushima's demand sounded like potential troubles that might rise again in the south. The problem was that Chosŭn's military was still far from being able to deal with potential troubles in the south, whether caused by Japan's central government or even by Tsushima. Long story short, in the 12th month of 1606, King Sonjo sent his envoy to Japan, to Edo, Tokyo, to the Tokugawa Bakufu. In the 7th month of the following year, 1607, King Sonjo's envoy returned back to Busan, carrying Tokugawa Hidetada's state letter addressed to King Sonjo. Tokugawa Hidetada was the shogun of Japan. But it means that Chosån Korea and Japan exchanged state letters and thereby restored their former diplomatic relationship of peace. Then Chosån restored trade privileges to Tsushima in the name of loose rein policy, as it was applied to the Jochins in the north. This way, the foreign relations, which were reshaped in the post-war era, brought stability to both Chosån and the region. Ironically, the long duration of regional stability in the post-war era owed much to what the Hideyoshi's invasion of Chosŏn had entailed. It is ironical in the sense that the war begat the disclosure of a volatile Japan. Here, a volatile Japan refers to the aggressive elements of Japan, which were often represented by the term Japanese pirates or wegu, who, as far as Chosŏn Koreans and Ming Chinese were all concerned, included the Hideyoshi regime. It means that the Koreans and Chinese regarded the Japanese as pirates, a troublemaker. So Japan's invasion of Chosŏn helped permanently wipe out the Japanese pirates from the scene, including the Hideyoshi regime, which had been a pain in the neck for long in premodernist Asia. So ironically, Japan's invasion of Korea helped the Japanese pirates being wiped out entirely. So when, with the disappearance of its pirates, Japan remained far from upsetting the geopolitical order of the region, but they came back from the 1870s with aggression again, eventually leading to the colonization of Korea and intrusion into China. In short, after the war, Chosŏn decided to restore the loose reign policy toward the Jochins and Tsushima while embracing the security buffer of a formal diplomacy with Ming China and with Japan, respectively. For Joseon, these bifurcated strategies were most cost-effective for its border security and dynastic longevity. These strategies worked quite well. That's why Chosån Korea lasted for long. Now I'd like to discuss Chosån Korea's post-war economy and society. Now for that, we can ask a question like this. How did the war experience affect the society and economy, which is measured by the quality of life in the post-war era when compared to quality of life in the pre-war period? Of course, during the war, all countries were affected negatively. All peoples suffered. But what about in the post-war era? Better off or worse off? More specifically, how did the war in Joseon affect the governments and people's behavior in the post-war era, and thereby impact on society and economy that determined the quality of life? We can ask the same question for China and Japan too. Some key points I find in post-war Chosån Korea, the commoners or 평민, the commoners, the ruled class, were worse off for long. In Japan, the commoners in the domains of the daimyo who led the troops to Joseon experienced a setback during the war, but in the post-war era, they were better off. Regarding Ming China, which was too vast and too complicated, it is hard to generalize, but when you look at Liaodong, which was most heavily affected by the war in Joseon, and other northern areas such as Tianjin and Shandong, people in those affected areas were worse off. So this diagram shows my findings. A setback during the war in all countries, but post-war trajectories were all different. In the case of Joseon getting worse, Japan getting better, China getting worse. So in the case of Chosån Korea, as far as the Chosŏn Koreans were concerned the war they experienced meant more than anything else two kinds of pains and sufferings. Number one, the sufferings of hunger, disease, and distress when they were lucky enough to alive, otherwise death. And the second, for able-bodied men, the fear of military service, which once drafted could mean hunger, suffering, or death because the government simply failed to feed them in most of the time. So once the war was over, against the backdrop of these harsh wartime experiences, Koreans all tried to find better ways of survival and safety. It was natural. The most critical goals they pursued were two. Number one, protecting the grain, which is food they produce as much as possible for their families. This is an issue of land tax, agricultural tax. Number two, keeping oneself from military service if possible. This is an issue of military service, meaning nobody want to serve in the military. So in the post-war era, all Koreans tried to achieve these two basic goals. And naturally, it led to a fierce competition. In this race of survival and safety, everybody tried to pay taxes of any kind as little as possible, or to evade them entirely while trying to accumulate agricultural land through whatever means available and as much as possible. So this is for food. In this race, the Yangban ruling class, who numbered about 10% of the entire population, proved to be a winner. It means that the loser were commoners and slaves. So believe or not, the slave population in Joseon society amounted to more or less 40% of the entire population, amazingly high. And this is a unique feature found only in Chosŏn Korea. They were permanent losers and slaves. What it means is that the Yangban families, who were major owners of agricultural land, were able to pressure the government to minimize land tax in the post-war era. They didn't want to pay taxes. The agricultural land tax rate is estimated to have been around 2 to 4% of the years, incredibly low. So tax income from agricultural land was far from being able to meet the government's financial needs. In comparison, the tax rate in Japan was in the 17th century, 60%, even 70%, and 2 centuries later, 30%. It's far, far higher. China, the tax rate was far higher than that in Korea as well. And then where did the government try to raise a needed revenue? Not from land tax, but from tribute tax. But the Yangban ruling class did not pay tribute tax in most cases either. And the commoners were forced to pay tribute tax. Now, furthermore, the tribute tax, which was mostly monetized and interlocked with a chain of corruption and extortion, literally ruined the commoner families. It was particularly so in the 17th century after the war. But these two documents show how the government squeezed the ruled class for tribute or tax collection. So there are so many documents we can see. And then what about the military service? In theory, men of good status, including the yangban and commoner man, in the ages of 16 to 60, were obliged to serve in the military, but no massive military drafting in the post-war era. But whenever troops were needed, the Joseon government, in most cases, primarily targeted commoner men, not yangban men. In theory, male slaves were all exempted from military service, even though they were mobilized later to some extent. The commoner men were the main source of Joseon's military forces. So this document in the screen shows what is known as the Gogang test. The Gogang test is a system according to which the government tested young men eligible for military service on Confucian learning. If they failed the exam, their right of exemption from military duty would be revoked. But virtually no yangban man failed in the test. It means that yangban men did an almost perfect job in evading military service, and the government did not dare to enforce military duty upon them. So all yangban men were exempted from ordinary military service. In Joseon society, in the post-war era, military service was regarded as being a job of social outcasts that fell upon the commoner class. And then were commoner men willing to serve the job of social outcasts. The document shows that commoner men who were unlucky enough to be designated for military duty were strictly guarded and transported to Hansung like prisoners. If they fled, their relatives were punished with imprisonment. The government did not dare to impose such military duty, which was a job of social outcasts, upon a yangban man. So commoner men and later male slaves, to some extent, suffered from military duty. In sum, the post-war era, Joseon was back on the track of the previous financial and military systems, but in a way that further damaged the commoner families. In post-war Joseon, the commoner class and the slaves were on the losing side in the race over material and safety and power. They were losing in every field of human pursuit, economy, politics, everything. And so based on all this, as a conclusion, I would like to think about the nature of Chosŏn Korea's longevity. In general terms, it is a question of what determines the longevity of a premodern dynasty. The key factors include the first, border security, as I have discussed. When the border is not protected, the dynasty in question collapses. So the question would be how the Joseon dynasty was able to secure its borders. In the post-war era, it was through diplomacy, as well as through loose reign policy. The second, domestic governance. For the king who exercises despotic power, governance is a matter of how to team up with the ruling class. The king alone cannot rule the country. He needs helpers. Helpers were the ruling class. We have just seen how Joseon kings worked with the yangban ruling class in the post-war era, not imposing heavy taxes upon them, not drafting them into the military divisions. There is another key issue, the kingship itself, which is preserved through the royal bloodline in any premodern dynasty. The Chosŏn dynasty is the dynasty of the descendants of its founder, Lee, the founding father of the Chosŏn dynasty. He's the founding father of the royal Yi family. For Chosŏn kings, for example, a dynasty ruled by Bak or Kim family has no meaning whatsoever. It's not their dynasty, so it has no meaning for them. In a sense, in a premodern dynasty is a family business. And so keeping the same royal bloodline is more important than anything else. They don't care for the well-being of people. In that sense, Lee-seung's descendants were quite successful in preserving their royal bloodline and thus kingship. So the Chosŏn Korea opted for securing its borders, north and south, with cost-effective diplomacy and loose rein policy, not with a costly military, at least from the 16th century. In the post-war era of border security, the Chosŏn dynasty continued to take recourse to diplomacy and loose rein policy, a combined strategy of survival, and it was associated with its weak military, as I have mentioned. And as I have stressed, the only way for Chosŏn kings to secure the dynasty was to run the country in alliance with the Yangban ruling class. In the post-war era, Chosŏn was back on the track of the previous financial and military systems, but in a way that really damaged the common families. And so all this encourages us to think about, in general terms, the nature of premodern power and governing structure, the governance, and that sustains a dynasty's longevity. This is a key topic for any history. So in that sense, the Imjin War and its aftermath are a treasure trove for study of history and human behavior in general. Thank you for your attention.